It's Wednesday, October 23rd. I'm Matt Harmon. Welcome to the Yahoo Fantasy Forecast. It is a hell of a day to talk ball, and joining me to do just that is Sal Vetri. Sal, what's going on, buddy?
Not much, man. We're in this interesting part of the season where a couple weeks away from the trade deadline, and it's already like the most active trade deadline we've seen in the past few seasons, and I think it's going to be even more active. Teams need maybe wide receivers, maybe a couple of defensive pieces on the move, so interested to see how the next week to two go.
Yeah, we haven't really talked about it much that the NFL moved the trade deadline back this year, and that feels super prescient, honestly, at this point, because I think several teams are going to need players. And we, at this point right now in the calendar, it's still a little hard to say, like, okay, there are a few teams that I think are completely out of it, right? But and deeper as we go into the season, there will be more and more teams that start to kind of look towards next year. People, certainly the fans and even people in the buildings, will start to look at mock drafts like, all right, let's get our early scouting in because that's really what we're going to care about. And maybe some more teams end up trading off receivers, running backs, who knows what here. Receivers certainly will be the position we watch the most because, man, Sal, I think this has to be the most brutal year from a wide receiver injury standpoint that I can remember. And I know it feels like I'm still torn up. I'm still like torn up about the Chris Godwin thing, and the Ayuk thing sucks too. But man, it just feels like honestly, some of the best picks that you could have made in fantasy drafts this year. You think back to like Rashee Rice, you think like Nico Collins, Rashid Shaheed, like all of these guys. Some of them maybe like Nico can come back, but several of these guys just completely wiped off the board, which I know, not to spin forward to offseason content, Sal, but that's going to be a big talking point. Like some of the best picks you could make this year are going to end up being running backs. I don't know that means anything going forward from a fantasy perspective, but yeah, it's just been a brutal, brutal year from a wide receiver injury standpoint.
Yeah, it seemed like that even before the season started with Puka Nacua, Jordan Addison, Jackson Smith-Njigba, some guys dealing with injuries throughout all of training camp, bringing them into the season. And then the first month of the season, guys go down, and it continued this past week. It seems like at this point, if you could just have a healthy fantasy team, you're a good team. Like you don't even have to draft well. You just have to remain healthy, maybe be somewhat active on the waiver wire. So it's been tough, and I think we're going to have to spin some of this stuff forward now with those injuries to your Chris Godwins, to your Brandon Ayuks, and how we're going to patch this together. And I think that's where we mentioned earlier some of this trade deadline stuff could come into play.
Yeah, I don't know who that healthy fantasy team is, but if you have one of those, congratulations to you because you're probably one of the best teams in the league. Although I have several teams that are really good and were really healthy until they lost Chris Godwin this week. So like you said, we are going to spin forward. That's what this podcast does here on the weekly Wednesday Data Dump Show. We try to pivot from the previous week to the week that's coming up, and we are now officially moving into week 8. So we are like halfway through the fantasy regular season. If your team is good, the holes and the areas that you need to patch, and hopefully some of the storylines that we're going to talk about through the stats, through the data dump here will help you with that.
Yes, science!
My calculations are correct. You're going to see some serious...
Sal, you're going to go first this week. Your first storyline has to do with a rookie running back who might be making some headway in his backfield.
Yeah, I want to talk about Tyron Tracy because I mentioned this on last week's show, heading into week 7, the biggest question mark in fantasy impact that I wanted to see was what the Giants backfield looked like once Devin Singletary returned. We got news early in the week last week that Singletary was practicing. He had a questionable tag, but we were told that he was going to play. But we were also told that Tyron Tracy's role would remain significant in the offense. And that's what we saw. He operated as the lead back. 67% of the snaps, had a team-high 9 backfield opportunities. Doesn't sound like a lot, but they were trailing by multiple scores and 20-plus points at some points against the Eagles in that one. But he operated in all situations. Early downs, third downs, 2-minute offense, 27 routes run compared to just 6 for Singletary. And I thought this was great to see. Now, of course, you could add the context like Singletary, aging veteran, returning from an injury, probably easing him back in some. But we also got the context before that they said, don't worry, we're still going to allow Tyron Tracy to be on the field. And even if this backfield starts to become closer to a 50-50 split, to me, it's just great news that a 5th-round rookie, not a 1st or 2nd-round pick that they put a lot of capital in, a 5th-round rookie they trust enough to put in this game in all of those crucial situations on third down, pass protection, and early down. So I think this is great news for Tyron Tracy. As of right now, he's still available in over 40% of Yahoo leagues. I'm trying to buy low on him where he's already picked up. I think this is a guy the rest of the season that has league-winning upside, and we saw it the last 2 or 3 weeks when Singletary was out.
Yeah, I love this call out. Tracy, I think, has looked really good to me. I've talked about it a lot that I think he, remember like when Antonio Gibson came into the league and it was sort of, or this is a converted wide receiver. He's going to be really active in the pass game and yada, yada. I think we've actually seen Tracy make, as another converted wide receiver, I think actually make some more nice moments in the passing game, if that makes sense. But really what I've been more impressed with him, and I think this is different from a guy like Antonio Gibson, is just like the rushing instincts and the base down ability with Tracy. So I feel like there's real staying power for him. I do have concerns about the Giants' offensive ecosystem overall, which I will talk about in one of my sections here. But reality is, like, if this guy's going to take over the running back one job, he's going to end up being somebody that you play every single week. Rough matchup this week with Pittsburgh, but the schedule is favorable after that.
Yeah, the schedule is very favorable. That's what I was going to bring up. Matchups against the Panthers, the Commanders, the Cowboys, the Saints, all of those are great running back matchups against the run. And also, like Tracy, you mentioned, in terms of comparing him to Gibson, we kind of saw this last year from Tracy in college at Purdue. He led the Big Ten in yards per carry, over 6 yards per carry in a tough conference against good defenses. We didn't really ever see that out of Antonio Gibson against weaker competition. So yeah, this is a guy who has the running back instincts. Andrew Thomas not being there is brutal for the Giants. I understand all of that, but when you're talking about a player who is either on waivers or probably pretty cheap right now after a poor productive performance from fantasy box scores this past week, he's somebody that I want on my team moving forward.
Yeah, 100%. Look, anytime you can get a guy who has passing down ability, which we're seeing, I thought that was significant. I'm glad you highlighted it, that he handled all those 2-minute drill snaps, the third down looks, things like that. If he's going to have passing down ability, that's going to buoy the floor of his fantasy outlook, even if the Giants offense starts to take several steps back. I really like him as somebody that you can kind of buy right now, maybe on the low, not even rostered in most of these leagues, which is crazy. I think he needs to be 100% rostered. He might be somebody that you consider starting this week. When you're kind of putting together weekly rankings early here, Sal, do you kind of have a ballpark of where he might slide in, just based on what we know now? And obviously, like I said, a bit of a tougher matchup with Pittsburgh.
Yeah, definitely somebody, the matchup's going to be tough. One of the best defensive lines in the league, but somebody that, assuming we don't get any reports that, Devin Singletary's taking back over this backfield, he's somebody that'll slide in. Definitely is a top 30 running back, probably around my running back 24, 25 range. For the rest of the season, he just cracks my top 100 overall players. That puts him in a range for me next to Javonte Williams, Rico Dotto, so I do value him, I think, higher than the market.
I think you're right to do so. I like that kind of grouping there with those backs. Let's move on to the next one here, and let's stick in the run game. We talked a lot, did Dalton and I, on the previous podcast about the passing game players with Tua coming back, but let's talk about the running back rotation here, again, within the context of we might be more interested in this offense with their starting quarterback back in the mix here.
Yeah, of course. We got them coming out of a bye week in week 7, and the big news was Devon Achane was coming back from his concussion, and he saw 57% of the snaps, led the backfield, 18 opportunities, led the backfield. Now, that was great to see if you spent your second-round pick on Achane, but some maybe concerns, at least for week 7, was that Raheem Mostert, we expected him to be involved. He was involved week 1 before he got injured, 34% of the snaps, 11 opportunities. Probably can expect him to see around a dozen opportunities, if not more, a week, depending on game script. But the big piece here that I want to call out is Jalen Wright remained involved. Now, it was only 9-10% of the snaps. It was only 5 opportunities, but this was not the case in week 1. And this rookie has come on now. In his last 2 games, one in week 5 before the bye when Achane got hurt, and then this past week with all 3 of these running backs active, he's averaged 6.6 yards per carry. He's done that now on 18 total opportunities. He's looked good. He's been, on a small sample, their most efficient running back, and I don't think they're just going to put him to 0 now. I think he's going to stay in there for maybe these 10 to 15 to 20% of the snaps per game, and that factors in. It factors in enough that he shouldn't be available in over 90% of Yahoo leagues right now, and it also makes me start to wonder, moving forward, once Tua is back, the offense remains efficient, we start to see what maybe a goal line role looks like for all 3 of these running backs. Should we have concerns about a second-round pick in Devon Achane moving forward? That's kind of a question that I'm sitting with as somebody who has him on some of my fantasy teams right now.
Yeah, I don't know. That's a really good question. I do think the outlook is better, right? Then I just feel like the entire offense is going to be better with Tua back out there. That feels obviously pretty clear. But the run game coming back and being efficient was interesting. And Jalen Wright's a guy that I do think is going to continue to be involved here. Now, a 3-man backfield, definitely look like that would definitely be a concern. We've talked about this with the Bucs. Once you get 3 guys into the mix here, that can be really problematic. I think Achane's still clearly the running back one of this group, and I feel like at this point, Raheem Mostert is pretty much just like somebody you can't really consider starting in fantasy because of this. But yeah, I don't know. Would it behoove them to get the rookie running back more involved, because he brings juice, and this team, I do think they're always looking for that counter punch, right? They haven't even found like a first pitch this year when Tua's been out, but they're always looking for that counter punch to Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle. I've thought at times, yeah, like maybe Achane can be that third pass catcher, and maybe that is still the case, but Wright as a rusher clearly brings something to this team that I think they need.
Yeah, and through the first 2 games of Tua, Achane was a top 3 fantasy back, put up 20-plus points in both contests. But of course, now some context has changed since then. I do think he's their most dynamic back. I have him as a top 25 player rest of season. But when I'm looking at my rest of season rankings and the other running backs around him are guys like Joe Mixon, James Cook, Jonathan Taylor potentially returning from injury this week, I think I might take all those guys over Achane.
I think I might be there with you as well. I'm kind of hesitant to launch Achane like back up to anything close to like a top 5 or even really top 7. You know, I'd rather have obviously like a Kyren Williams, a Jahmyr Gibbs, I think, over Achane at this point. I mean, yeah, Mixon, I think definitely. So there's some guy even. Shoot, would you rather take like one of the 49ers backs? I mean, it's kind of hard because McCaffrey's coming back, but you know, I think when McCaffrey's back, and if he's even like 80% usage-wise, what we've seen before, I think I might rather have him, especially how much you're going to have to rely on him with some of these wide receiver injuries than a guy like Achane.
Yeah, McCaffrey, I have 3 spots below Achane amongst all players, so they're neck and neck in my running back rankings rest of season. I think I'm a little bit more concerned than maybe the market about McCaffrey. The news that he could return in Week 10 doesn't really give me a lot of security that he could return, and what's that role look like when I know right now we have a healthy Achane who's already played his bye week.
Dolphins' schedule coming up from a rushing game perspective is really good, though. Cardinals in Week 8, Bills in Week 9. You know that, it's kind of a little bit of a double-edged sword there because, we've seen the Bills' defense completely block out this Dolphins offense like we did in Week 2. Tua played a bunch of that game, and the offensive production was not great. But they did give Achane a lot of opportunities. I don't know, you could kind of talk outside of both your sides of your mouth there, especially because that's been a bad run defense generally, but it's not really quite the type of perimeter run game that Miami has. Rams in Week 10, Raiders in Week 11, Patriots in Week 12. Like, this is a really good stretch coming up here for the Dolphins offense overall, but especially the run game. I guess my question, Sal, is like, if you could, on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being like, lock it in, no doubt about it, they just go right. I'm super confident they go right back to what they were. 1 being, yeah, I'm pretty skeptical. Where are you in terms of like your confidence that the Dolphins offense just goes back to the top 5 unit we're used to once Tua gets back in here?
Yeah, I think there's 2 parts to this for me. I think I'm probably at like a 6. Like, I feel pretty confident that they go back to that, but then I'm really concerned that Tua takes one more hit and he's just absolutely done for the year. Like, these concussions, as somebody who had a concussion that lasted like 15 months, it gets to a point where you have bad concussions that you can just fall over and hit your head one certain way, and that's 2 months, you're completely done. Like, when it gets this bad. So that's where my concern comes in rest of season. I think at this point, Achane is probably not like a panic type player. I thought it was interesting, or at least worth hashing out the conversation. Maybe the biggest takeaway is Jalen Wright available in 92% of leagues right now. He is not rostered compared to these other running backs. Tajay Spears, Emmanuel Wilson, Roschon Johnson, even Blake Corum are all rostered well ahead of him. I think he should be closer to those guys, if not more.
I like it. Yep. I think that is the big takeaway here, regardless of kind of how we feel about Achane. I will say though, Sal, 6 out of 10 is not very confident. That's not that confident. So I kind of see where you're at there, and I feel like the same way generally. Let's stay in the AFC East. Let's move to a quarterback who's been pretty good through his first 2 starts.
Yeah, and I want to talk about Drake May now. We have 2 starts out of him, one where he had to go to London, which is never great traveling for a rookie quarterback, having to take that all into account, and he's completed 66% of his passes, 7.4 yards per attempt is above the NFL average, and from a fantasy perspective, you've gotten 2 top 10 finishes during that time. Now, the interesting thing to me is, during these 2 starts, he's been pressured on 39 of his 96 dropbacks. That's 41% of them. That's a lot of them. But because of his mobility, he's been able to keep plays alive. He's been able to manage the pocket pretty well. Like, you're looking at his overall performances. You might look at some stats in terms of efficiency and be like, it's average to below average. But keep in mind, he's had 2 starts, and the receiver production around him right now has not been great. You have Jalen Polk dropping passes. You have Demario Douglas leaving their last game early. He was their number 1 receiver, not even on the field like a starting receiver. And the last game, he was sick. He had an illness. He wasn't even out there for more than half of the game. So he's really been doing this with like Hunter Henry and just a cast of other wide receivers who are out there not really doing much. So I've been impressed at this point with Drake May. From a fantasy perspective, as a quarterback, like if you're trying to find the escape plan for your 4th or 5th round Anthony Richardson or Patrick Mahomes, this is the guy who's available right now in over 80% of fantasy leagues as of this recording. And then he gives some life to guys like Hunter Henry, available on majority of waiver wires. Demario Douglas, who I'm not giving up on just because he was sick on Saturday morning, that game in London. And then even guys like Ramondre Stevenson, I want to hold out and see what happens with this offense rest of the season, because Drake May is sustaining drives and getting this offense to the red zone, which is where Stevenson can have those upside weeks.
Yeah, I mean, I'm 100% with you. I've been super impressed with Drake May, regardless of how he ends up, how his career goes, right? I think the one thing we can definitely say is that any idea that, he was years away from being ready looks pretty stupid in hindsight, because he has been, I don't know about, he's not been perfect, certainly, but he has looked ready to be on an NFL field here in week 6, week 7 of his career. Honestly, maybe they should have just been playing him all along just to kind of get him up to speed here, because I feel like with a lot of these receivers, there has definitely been issues. Douglas would have loved some better reporting on that heading into week 7, that he was, ill or whatever, that he might not be ready to play a full snap share, because he's definitely their most reliable guy right now. The rest of these players are just not reliable at this point. Kendrick Bourne is coming back from an injury. Jalen Polk, man, it's so crazy when you see a player like this, Sal, that I would say the 2 things that, not a perfect prospect, but the 2 things that really stood out about him was he was a reliable guy. He had good hands, and he was like, he would give a lot in the blocking game. And those have been 2 of the areas where I think he's been the worst so far as a pro. And I do think they're playing him out of position. I don't love the downfield X receiver usage for him. It's not what he did in college. I think he's probably frustrated by that usage too, but then he is compounding those things by making these mistakes, and he just wasn't a mistake-prone player in college. So you wonder what's going on there. He's posting the peace sign on his Instagram story afterwards. Just seems weird. That's unfortunate that he's not able to build timing and chemistry with this guy throughout the course of his career so far. So we'll see. May has in interviews too taken a lot of responsibility about this. It's my job to get these guys going, to get them engaged in the game and all this stuff. So he says all the right things. He does all the right things. I just kind of wish we had seen him from week 1. But yeah, I'm with you. I've been really impressed with what I've seen through the first 2 starts of his career.
Yeah, and he just seems composed. It reminds me at times, different player for sure, but CJ Stroud in his rookie year, under pressure early on in that season, and just seems unfazed by it. Pockets collapsing around him, kind of just finds an exit route either with his legs or some checkdowns to running backs. A couple of times that happened. I think it was to JaMychal Hasty in week 7. He just looks solid out there. And yeah, Jalen Polk, reliable as hands-wise in terms of college. That can definitely come through for us. It's just been 7 games. I am a little bit concerned about the coaching aspect of what's going on right now in New England and how well they can coach their players up. But maybe that's a thing that we just worry about in future years. And Drake May, we just feel excited from a fantasy standpoint that he himself can sustain production at the quarterback position and help out a couple of other pieces that we actually care about in this offense.
Yeah, Gerard Mayo's been under a lot of fire. I don't know how fair it all is, because I think some of his quotes have been taken a little bit out of context, but at the same time, he said that this team is playing soft right now. And then you have, the guy who he's replacing, on 100 shows in Bill Belichick this year, just kind of ready to react to the reaction of this stuff. So tough spot for Mayo to be in, but I don't know that they have been a well-coached team so far this year. I'm willing to give Mayo grace, but I'm with you that I feel at some point during the course of May's career, we will have a conversation about is Alex Van Pelt enough here from a play calling standpoint, from an offensive design standpoint? Not the most creative, not the most interesting offense in the entire world, but that is a future season problem. For now, I love your call out about him being potentially your escape hatchet for a guy like Mahomes or Richardson, these disappointing players so far that you've maybe been rolling out there every single week. I will ask you, though, before we move off this, next 3 games, Jets, Titans, Bears, all three pretty tough defenses before we get to week 11. The Dolphins, they're actually a pretty good pass defense too. I think I should start showing them a little more respect. But week 11, they get the Rams. Week 12, they get the Dolphins. Again, pretty good pass defense. Week 13, they get the Colts. They don't have a bye till week 14. That's brutal for a really, really young team like this. Any concern with that upcoming schedule? Like I said, Jets, at Titans, at Bears, the next 3 games.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, we're gonna see what Drake May is made of. I think this is a situation where they're probably going to continue to play from behind, and if that's the case, give me 35 to 40 dropbacks, if not more. Give me 6-7 plus scrambles, and from a fantasy perspective, feel good about it. And then rest of season, as you pointed out a little bit there, you get matchups against the Colts, the Cardinals, even the Bills to some extent entering the fantasy postseason. Where if this is a guy that has to replace Mahomes for you, those are decent spots.
Yeah, I love that's just. You could have just said yes. Like, yes, very concerning. Titans are number 1 in defensive success rate. The Bears are number 4. The Jets are number 11 in success rate allowed this year. So that will definitely be a big test, but I do think May's the type of quarterback who can make it work even in bad conditions here. Let's move to number 4. Do a little check-in on a backfield in the AFC North.
Yeah, I want to check in on the Bengals backfield. After what we saw in week 7, we got Chase Brown now, who seems to be like trending up all season long in terms of usage. He earned a team high 58% of the snaps in this game. And more importantly, he commanded 71% of the running back carries, which was his best usage alongside Zach Moss all season. Now, fantasy managers who have him on their team know that it wasn't a great performance for Chase Brown. 54 scoreless yards on 17 touches. Maybe this opens up a buy low window, though. And the 17 opportunities and touches is something that I thought was really interesting. Because now for the second straight game, we've seen good usage for Chase Brown ahead of Zach Moss. 2 games ago, Moss kind of got benched in the fourth quarter for a fumble. But overall, if you look at the numbers, it's 60% of the snaps and 67% of the carries for Chase Brown these last 2 weeks. Now, it's kind of interesting. Like in the preseason, heading into the season, we kind of had this idea like Zach Moss is the early down guy, and it'll be Chase Brown trying to catch passes on these 3rd down and long situations. And like right now, at least after week 7, it's kind of like a flippening is happening. Chase Brown's commanding all the early down usage according to PFF. It's Zach Moss right now who's out there in the 2-minute drill, in the 3rd down and long situations, most likely because they trust him more in pass protection right now. But it's interesting. Like, I think there's opportunity for Chase Brown to earn some of those snaps he has in past weeks. And if that's the case, you can unlock this guy moving forward. They want to get him on the field. He's creating explosive plays much more at this point compared to Zach Moss. Top 10 in explosive run rate, averaging 5 yards per touch. I think it's a nice situation to maybe buy low on Chase Brown, but just address kind of every week he continues to see more usage in this backfield.
Yeah, 100%. I love your call out on this. And I think that, yeah, I mean, whether the usage is to preseason expectations, I would say that, I mean, Moss makes sense as that 3rd down and pass blocking back, like you mentioned, the 2-minute drills. But yeah, I mean, Moss kind of profiles as that banger back just because of his size and everything. And Brown, you think because he's explosive, he'd be the passing down guy. But they've really just never been all that interested in trusting Brown in that way, like from a 2-minute drill type of perspective, 3rd downs, long down and distance situations. So I bet Moss continues to see those plays, but you're right that this is a team that's hunting for explosives. They're always like, again, much like the Dolphins, right? They're always hunting for that 3rd pitch. We've got Higgins, we've got Chase. That's great. What else do we do? They're trying to find that dimension in the backfield right now, I think, with Chase Brown, who should probably lead the team in carries at least going forward, bare minimum. I look at the upcoming schedule for them. They're going to be involved in a lot of like what I would call, some back and forth games, maybe some close games. Eagles this week, Raiders. They should blow out the Raiders. Let's be serious here. At Ravens, at Chargers, bye week in week 12, and then the Steelers and the Cowboys in week 13, 14. I feel like there's a lot of games there that will be pretty close. Even if there's some tougher defensive matchups for the run game, you'd imagine that game script wise, like I think we need to get into our mind here that Chase Brown is the early down sort of banger back. So games that should be closer contested, he actually probably profiles a little bit better in those games.
Yeah, and I think like as of right now, a lot can change in maybe 6 to 8 weeks on some of these matchups. But if you do look at his fantasy schedule, that one is not as appealing. You have matchups against like the Broncos, you have matchups against the Titans in there. So that could be a situation where at that point, he maybe is just somebody that you are secure is getting 16 plus touches, and he's just healthy at that point, right? But as of right now, he's somebody I want to buy because I view him rest of season around guys like Brian Robinson, DeAndre Swift, J.K. Dobbins, James Conner. Like I'm around the top 50 overall player across all positions rest of season on Chase Brown. The trajectory is there. He's playing really well. And if that just continues, you have to keep giving this guy more opportunities in different ways. And I believe in what we're seeing right now in this Bengals offense, despite what their real life record says. They're moving the ball downfield. They're getting to the red zone. You're getting Chase Brown already with 20-plus point fantasy days. And I think we could have more in the future.
I like that. That is an aggressive ranking, Sal Vetri, in terms of where you have Chase Brown. But I can see the vision here. I'm maybe not all the way there, but I feel pretty good. Like he could get there. I maybe need a couple more weeks of evidence, but I like that you're already ahead of the curve there. So we'll continue to check in on that Bengals backfield. Final stat from you here is about the Texans offense and just where they're at right now.
Yeah, the Texans offense, specifically the last 2 full games that they've now had completed without Nico Collins in this offense. I'm looking at it as through these last 2 games, they're bottom 10 in passing efficiency. If you look at it each week, in week 6, CJ Stroud averages 6.2 yards per attempt, below the NFL average. Week 7 against the Packers kind of fell off a cliff overall, 4.1 yards per attempt in that game. And something that I noticed while kind of just looking through a lot of this, it became obvious this past week. Like the Packers were just getting to Stroud nonstop. The pressure was there for sure. But over the last 2 weeks, CJ Stroud is currently being pressured 39% of the time when he drops back, which is 34th in the NFL. And on these, he's not completing passes at all. He's bottom 5 in the NFL in passes under pressure the last 2 weeks. And then I'm like, okay, maybe he just hasn't been good under pressure all year. Not the case. When Nico Collins was out there the first 5 weeks, he was a top 3 quarterback under pressure this season, completing 63% of his passes. So it is a small sample of just 2 games. Whenever you have one of the game's best receivers out, of course, your offense is going to start to struggle. But I just saw that it was this dramatic. We saw it kind of fall off a cliff this past week. And now I'm kind of worried a little bit moving forward with beneficial matchups against the Colts this upcoming week. Sure. But also, we haven't really seen anything for the whole season from a fantasy perspective out of Stroud these last 2 or 3 weeks that we can rely on him to start him in even good matchups. But now I'm wondering, like Tank Dell, Stephon Diggs. Sure, maybe against the Colts you start them, but moving forward while Nico is out, can I trust these guys?
Yeah, it's a great point. I mean, the Colts is such a layup matchup, although, you do have to have like some really strong fortitude to just throw Tank Dell back out there after getting you a straight 0 spot. But the snaps were there. He obviously could have just caught that touchdown that he didn't really bring in, and we'd be having a different conversation about this. But yeah, I mean, games like the Jets in Week 9, that's a totally different side of the story here. Week 10, man, that's when Nico's eligible to come off IR. They get the Lions that week. Let's hope he's back at that point. Then they get Cowboys, Titans, Jaguars before their Week 14 bye. But yeah, man, I'm with you that it doesn't seem as just like, man, it shouldn't be as obvious as just Nico Collins is not out there and that's the problem. But like, yeah, man, Nico Collins is so good. You take an elite receiver off of their team, the rest of the offense goes to hell. Like that's kind of how it works. Like Nico Collins, not Justin Jefferson, but what would the Vikings offense look like without Justin Jefferson? And that's kind of, he's maybe not in that grouping, but he's in that next group there in terms of wide receivers overall. So feel really just tough about this offense without Nico Collins, because Diggs is still good, but I don't think he's necessarily like a true number 1 at this point. Dell, obviously, I continue to say is not 100%. So you just look across the course of this Texans offense, specifically in the passing game, because Mixon helps the run game. The line's not playing that well. I think the receiver room without Nico it's fine, but it's not great. And yeah, Stroud, just under all this pressure, has to just kind of pull things out of nowhere, and that's a tough way to live.
Yeah, and Nico being out, like we said, is going to slump this offense, but the hope, at least from like a fantasy perspective, is somebody fills that void. Stephon Diggs is a weekly top 10 receiver now, initially when Nico Collins was out. Tank Dell's finally going to break out. We got a little bit of that a couple weeks back. It was some short fields against the Giants that helped them get there, in my opinion. But now I'm to the point where I don't feel like I can trust these guys, and you see what they're doing with the offense. Joe Mixon, carry the ball 20 to 25 times. What matchup comes up now against the Colts? A matchup where you could probably do that 20 to 25 times. So although it's another juicy matchup for the pass catchers, like Diggs is probably in your lineup, I don't think I could put Dalton Schultz and Tank Dell back out there again.
Yeah, and in terms of CJ Stroud, maybe a fringe top 12 quarterback this week.
Yeah, this past week against the Packers, he didn't make my top 15 quarterback rankings, and I put those out on Twitter, and I knew there was going to be some pushback on that, and I was like, listen, this is just kind of how this ranking is at this point for what I'm looking at. It ended up not panning out, and that's just kind of the way that it's seeing. This pressure, it was the Giants a couple weeks ago, good defensive line, okay, fine. This Packers this past week, I think it's a sneaky defensive line, but nothing elite by any means, and they were getting there at will, and it didn't seem like Stroud felt comfortable going to Diggs, going to Dell, whether that was the receiver's fault, their connection's fault, whatever it was, without Collins out there, and I think that's still going to be the case moving forward.
Yeah, I mean, I'm probably going to rank guys like Sam Darnold, Jared Goff, Kirk Cousins ahead of C.J. Stroud this week. Maybe even without the wide receivers, maybe even Baker Mayfield against the Falcons. I'll be kind of debating that one. So we shall see. Bummer. Hopefully we get better performances out of this Texans offense. And my God, hopefully we get Nico Collins back on the field as soon as possible. All right, let's take our first break. When we come back, we'll run through my 5 stats people need to know heading into week 8 right after this. All right, we're back. Let's talk through the stats I have here. Number 1, I'm going to talk about Eagles' volume distribution in A.J. Brown's healthy games this year, which is week 1, and then the past 2, week 6 and week 7. A.J. Brown, in these games, 56.3% share of the air yards, absolutely massive, 31.1% of the team targets. Fantasy points data has him at 41.3% share of the first read targets. He's the top scoring wide receiver that's played all 3 games in this range. Meanwhile, Devontae Smith has just a 16.6% share of the air yards, 17.6% of the targets. And a lot of that is because, again, in these 3 games, he has a 7.5 average depth of target, and he's been in the slot on 72% of his routes. No one else, meanwhile, has more than 6 targets. Like Saquon has 6. Both tight ends, Dallas Goedert and Grant Calcaterra, have 6. Like there's nothing going on in this passing game. And the reason I think this is interesting to talk about, Sal, is one, obviously, is A.J. Brown the wide receiver 1 rest of the way? I think he's he's in my top tier for sure. Absolutely, no question about it. The Devontae Smith part of this is a little tricky because I think that the Eagles, when they've been at their best this year, it's when they've leaned into the run game. This note from Brandon Thorne, who's one of the best offensive line analysts in the game, from Twitter, I thought was interesting. He says the Eagles ran the ball 45 times for 269 yards, 3 touchdowns. In the second half, they had 29, 174, and 2 touchdowns against the Giants, with their offensive line putting on a double and combo blocking clinic. Leverage, strain, and discipline. Brandon has a bunch of great clips as well, just showing sort of the way that offensive line played against the Giants, which is a good defensive front, by the way. I feel like that's the best version of the Eagles offense, Sal, is in the run game. We lean heavily into that. We lean heavily into Saquon. That offensive line is cooking. Saquon is one of the best backs in the league right now. And in the passing game, they kind of keep things simple, and most of it is shot plays on the outside, especially when they get single coverage to A.J. Brown. So where does that leave us with a guy like Devontae Smith, who I think we have to expect to be pretty boom bust going forward?
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it. Boom bust in terms of our expectations. When he was like a 3rd-round pick in your fantasy drafts, you probably were expecting secure 7 targets a game, these 12 to 15-point weeks. Right now, if I had to redraft, I think he'd still be a 3rd-round pick, just with those different expectations that he is this boomer bust player. But so far, he's coming off of a bad game, 1 target. They only threw 14 times in that game because of all the success running, like you just mentioned. But before that, he had at least 13 or more fantasy points in every game. Of course, half of those were without A.J. Brown. But I don't really hate this slot role for him. Now, of course, it's going to lead to less downfield explosive plays, but we saw it really flourish in week 1 against the Packers. I thought it was a nice balance of him being used in the slot, being put in motion, winning after the catch, which is something he can do, taking advantage of his solid route running. And then also a couple of these plays where you can get him in space downfield as well. I don't hate that moving forward, especially in games where Philadelphia is forced to throw more. Like A.J. Brown, top 5 overall player rest of the season. The only guys I have ahead of him right now for me are Saquon, Jefferson, and Chase, and you could even argue those wide receivers if you wanted to, which is crazy. The Eagles have 2 fantasy assets that high, and that just kind of goes into what we're talking about here. There's not much left for the rest of these guys, but I look at the schedule moving forward. The next 7 matchups for the Eagles, they face 7 bottom half of the league secondaries, according to PFF. So, they're going to want to run the ball still first, but they're going to get in these situations where they're not facing the Giants, who they're up by 20 to 30 on, who Saquon is just having the best revenge game you can ever imagine against, and they're going to be in more situations like you saw, honestly, the last month of the season, where they're either trailing or in closer game scripts, and I think that's where we start to get back to Devonta Smith's 6 to 8 plus target weeks. Teams probably start to shift coverage a little bit more the way that they're defending A.J. Brown. We actually saw this the first half of the year last year. Teams adjusted. Devonta Smith was open a little bit more. I think we could see that. I think it's maybe a buy low spot if somebody's willing to trade you Devonta Smith after one bad week. I'd be interested in looking at those offers.
Yeah, you mentioned that schedule for the Eagles. I just pulled it up too. At Cincinnati this week, Jacksonville in week 9, at Dallas in week 10, Commanders in week 11, at the Rams in week 12, at the Ravens in week 13, week 14, they get the Carolina Panthers in Philadelphia. I mean, that from a defensive perspective, maybe we'll talk about one of those defenses here in a second that I think is improving a little bit. But for the most part, that is a clear runway for basically anybody. I mean, Saquon obviously is going to smash a bunch of those defenses. Like, what is he going to do to Dallas in week 10? What is he going to do to Cincinnati this week? The Rams in week 12, but like there's a lot of spots as well where I think this passing game can really get going. So I'm glad you're at least giving me a little pushback here on this Devonta Smith. I'm not going to call it panic, but maybe adjusting expectations here and leaning into that volatility. But if we are leaning into that volatility, I'm always fine doing that, especially with a really good player like a Devonta Smith. So I don't know, ballpark me, like who are some receivers, just so people kind of have a range of outcomes in mind. Who are some receivers, rest of season that you kind of have him in a similar range with?
Yeah, I have him right now, right behind T. Higgins, right ahead of DK Metcalf, right ahead of Garrett Wilson. Like, I would trade Garrett Wilson. Same position's always weird, but I would trade Garrett Wilson for Devonta Smith if I could right now. Jaden Reed's in that same area, Terry McLaurin, Brian Thomas. I think also to point out, the Giants average 2.2 yards per play on offense. I don't know if another offense all year will do that against the Eagles. Sure, their defensive line is solid, but that is absolutely brutal, and that's something that, probably favors the passing game more if some other offenses can just do anything better than that.
What a great transition, Sal Vetri. 2.2 yards per play to my second point here, which let's stick in that same game that just happened. Is the Giants ecosystem completely falling apart, and is it going to drag down Malik Neighbors? I think is a question worth asking. So it's funny because Daniel Jones, he's kind of a weird quarterback, right? But he's also kind of a straightforward quarterback. You pressure him, bad things happen. You don't pressure him, he can be functional. He can run we've seen him run functional NFL offenses when he's protected. So on that note, weeks 1 to 6 pressure rate per PFF on Daniel Jones, 36% of his dropbacks. And again, when he's pressured, he has a 4.1 YPA in those games. He has a 16.7 pressure to sack ratio, which is actually not that bad. That's actually pretty good. Week 7, completely everything falls apart. Again, this is from Pro Football Focus. He pressured on 46.7% of his dropbacks. He went 3 of 5 for, again, 4.2 yards per attempt. But the big thing here is he took 7 sacks on 14 pressure. I mean, 50% pressure to sack rate is just abhorrent. It's disgusting. This note from Next Gen Stats is interesting here. The Eagles defense recorded all of their sacks with a 4-man pass rush against the New York Giants in week 7. It was the most sacks and the highest sack rate, 21.6%, with a 4-man pass rush in a game this season. The Giants know they've got an offensive line problem. You mentioned up at the top, Andrew Thomas being out is a huge issue for this team. He is one of the best left tackles in the league, just a total superstar. Him being out for the season is a problem. Adam Schefter reports this morning that former Cardinals first-round pick DJ Humphries, who is recovering from a torn ACL suffered last season, is visiting with the New York Giants today. Don't know if that's going to solve all the problems, but they're at least trying. And this tweet from Josh Norris, I saw it in the preseason, as we're seeing Daniel Jones, throw a bunch of interceptions in the preseason. This continues to ring around in my head. Josh notes that he had to scroll down, this is obviously before the season, to wide receiver 29 in points per game last season to find the first wide receiver who played in an offense that was bottom 7 in touchdowns scored. Your current bottom 9, and I'm doing bottom 9 here to account for like games played, a couple ties, just in terms of total points. These are the 9 teams: Dolphins, Giants, Patriots, Titans, Chargers, Browns, Panthers, Rams, Raiders. Sal, I mean, other than Malik Neighbors, who is in this group because of the Giants, how many superstar wide receivers do we have in this group? Not a lot. The Dolphins guys have been ultra disappointing. Nothing's happening in Tennessee. Nothing's happened in LA with the Chargers. The Browns are a mess. We just finally got Amari Cooper out of there. Your best receiver is probably like Deontay Johnson, who's coming off a 1-catch game. Injuries, but still. So look, Malik Neighbors is great. He's still somebody you're going to start every single week, but I'm a little concerned that with Andrew Thomas out, with the offensive line struggling, Daniel Jones taking all this pressure, we might have already seen the best days this season for Neighbors. And it's not because of his fault. Nothing to do with him at all. Great player. But it's tough for any wide receiver to survive in a horrendous environment. And I'm a little concerned that this is going to end up being one of the most horrendous offensive environments in the league.
Yeah, the Andrew Thomas news is brutal. I mean, he's one of the few players that's a non-quarterback or wide receiver for an offense that really, really moves the needle. We saw it last year. Like, the Giants' offensive line was legitimately historically bad. Andrew Thomas gets banged up. We see him come back this year. Still a bad offensive line, but it's good enough, mostly because of Andrew Thomas, that they can just get by. They can sustain drives, they can get to the red zone, and they could actually put up productive days for Malik Neighbors. Now, in terms of like what Neighbors looks like rest of season, it's really hard for me to do anything but hold him on my team. I actually feel like pretty confident moving forward, and a lot of that's just due to all the other injuries happening at the wide receiver position. Like, the offense is probably going to get worse, but they're not going to face the Eagles, who have arguably the best pass rush in the NFL every week. Although they will face the Steelers this week, who have arguably the best pass rush in the NFL. But after that, it does open up a little bit. You get the Panthers, brutal pass rush. The Commanders, hit or miss pass rush. Into the fantasy postseason, the schedules, at least at the wide receiver position, you're facing teams like the Colts, the Panthers I mentioned, the Saints. These are matchups that I feel good about for Malik Neighbors. So in terms of where I rank him rest of season, yeah, like I still think he's that second round type pick for fantasy football, somebody you feel good about being an anchor of your team, but they need to figure out this offensive line. They don't have a bye week for like another month of the season, and that really hurts them. I think it's week 11 for the Giants. At this point right now, I'm hoping after the Steelers matchup, those softer defensive lines they'll face can really help smooth things out for the passing attack, but I am holding my breath this week once again against Pittsburgh.
I'm also just like, I don't know if this is good or bad, but we might be in like Drew Lock territory coming out of that week 11 bye. Shoot, Brian Daboll sounds like a guy when you hear him talk, he's ready to live in Drew Lock world right now, which
I think Daniel Jones might be too. Like, the dude's just getting destroyed back there. If I'm Daniel Jones, I'm like, I'll take a seat for a week or two.
I don't know, buddy. Look, nobody wants to get hurt, but he gets out there, he takes a big hit, he activates those injury guarantees. He's looking at that like life-changing money there. So I don't know if I'm Daniel Jones. I'm starting to, oh, Jesus Christ. Knock my mic down as I'm saying this. I don't know. Let me recover here. I don't know. I'm thinking like weighing options there if I'm Daniel Jones. Look, obviously I'm joking. He clearly does not want to suffer some like major injury. That would be horrible. But for God's sakes, man, it's tough at this point for the Giants offense. Yeah, I like that we have some of these matchups coming up. You know, obviously we've seen him tear up the damn Commanders before. We've 18 targets in week 2 against this defense. Week 10, Malik Neighbors should certainly get over on the Panthers, but you know, and Giants and Dallas and Tampa on the other side. There's a lot of spots here, but I'm just concerned about this offensive environment. Just in terms of those wide receivers, like I mentioned, points per game in these bad offenses. Deontay Johnson, like I said, probably a guy who's played all year in one of these offenses. I think he's probably the best receiver outside of Neighbors, who's wide receiver 6 in points per game. Deontay Johnson's wide receiver 31 in points per game. Look, Neighbors is so good, he can be the outlier here, and I don't think he's suddenly going to crater outside of the top 29 wide receivers in points per game. But yeah, I mean, we could ultimately look back and say like those games at the beginning of the season where Jones was protected could end up being his best fantasy days. Let's stick on rookies here. Let's talk about, and actually the team I wanted to talk about here in terms of defense potentially improving. Let's talk about the Bears offense off the bye versus the Washington Commanders. A lot of young players for Chicago, a lot of new things. So I'm always curious about what teams look like coming off the bye. But I do wonder, and I think a lot of people will view this as a potential smash spot for the Bears offense. And I generally might be there by the end of the week, but it's worth noting at least in week 5, weeks 5 to 7, we kind of view this Commanders defense as a cupcake, but they played the Browns, they played the Ravens, and then they've played the Panthers. So 2 pretty atrocious offenses, 1 pretty good offense. In this stretch, 7th overall EPA per play allowed, 14th in success rate overall. They're definitely much better defending the pass in this stretch than the run. 21st in rushing EPA allowed, 6th in dropback EPA allowed. Some of this is turnovers and sacks and things like that. That's how you get your EPA up and your success rate's still a little bit lower. But look, I mean, creating sacks and turnovers is good. Again, I understand that they played the Browns, who are a joke, and the Panthers, who also might be a joke. But they did play the Ravens in here, and the Ravens kind of, I would say, pretty good offensive effort overall. But the Ravens are the best offense in the league. They're gonna do that to you. So I'm just wondering if it's time to adjust a little bit of expectations for this Commanders defense, what we're expecting in this matchup, potentially of the 1st and 2nd overall pick, although we have to monitor Jaden Daniels' injury status. A few notes on the Bears offense, Sal. According to Next Gen Stats, Caleb Williams has completed 34 of his 47 attempts towards in-breaking routes this year. It's his EPA on such attempts is 3rd most in the NFL. That's pretty encouraging. We've also seen real concentration in the Bears offense. Only DJ Moore, Keenan Allen, Rome Odunze, and Cole Kmet ran a route on more than 50% of the dropbacks in weeks 5 and 6, according to Fantasy Points data. No other wide receiver ran a route in these two games. DeAndre Swift ran a route on 59.3% of the dropbacks. Gerald Everett, Mercedes Lewis, the depth tight ends, ran 18 routes combined. So, like, this offense has really constricted itself, which is always good for fantasy, to DJ Moore, Keenan Allen, Rome Odunze, and Cole Kmet. Now, the target tree, though, is still, at least in these two games, pretty spread out. Keenan Allen leads the team with a 26% first read target share. That's 36th among all pass catchers in this span. And it's largely because he had 3 end zone targets and 4 of his 10 first read targets came on 4th or 3rd down, which is, by the way, the exact role I expected Keenan Allen to play coming in this year. 3rd down, around the end zone, critical down and distance situations, he can still get you that short, quick separation. Rest of the first read target share, DJ Moore 21%, Rome Odunze 18%, Cole Kmet 16%. So kind of a double little question here, Sal, which is, 1, do we need to adjust expectations on this Commanders defense? And 2, is this just going to be a very concentrated but like spread out offense at the very top of the pecking order in Chicago?
Yeah, in terms of the Commanders, I think this is the week that I'll know for sure. As of right now, I want to just call the bluff on the Commanders defense because of those matchups against the Browns and the Panthers. Andy Dalton by far his worst performance of the season. But again, some of that is because he was facing a Commanders defense that forced that out of him. But we did see the matchup against the Ravens. Lamar still went for like 300 yards. I believe it was Flowers, Andrews, and Bateman's all best day of the season. So like I'm at this point where I'm like, you have two extremes, the best offense in the league and two of the worst. So like something in between, somewhere in between. The Bears off the bye kind of feel like that, the way that they're trending right now. And I think it sets up nicely for them because there's been some passing defense success from the Commanders during this stretch, but their pass rush hasn't really improved too much from what I've seen, at least numbers wise. And that's really where the Bears have like struggled. If their offensive line falls apart from the pass rush, it's going to leak into everything else in their offense. The last couple of weeks, they've had sort of cupcake matchups in terms of pressure they faced, and it's looked great for Caleb Williams. He's only getting better. He's only getting more reps under his belt. Now he goes into the bye week. That should help the entire offense get healthy, figure out some more stuff, and prepare for this matchup where I think everything feels good. Like I think you start Williams, you start Swift, you start all your Bears. Odunze, hopefully we see something out of the bye from him. It just feels hard for something to happen. Like they're already using him. He's already in the role we kind of want. It's just that there's other guys in this offense, like a Keenan Allen you mentioned, that are getting some of the priority targets. And at some point, there's just not as much left for the guy that you spent the 9th or 10th round fantasy pick in Odunze. But for this specific week, I feel good about all the Bears coming out of that bye week. And after the week, I think we're going to know pretty definitively, is this Washington defense actually improving or has it just been those matchups?
Yeah, I mean, DJ Moore is wide receiver 24 in points per game. Keenan Allen's wide receiver 50. Rome Odunze is wide receiver 64. I think all those guys actually can go up a little bit, or at least like Allen and Odunze can go up as the offense improves. And the fact that we've cut out like the DeAndre Carter and some of the Gerald Everett stuff, that's good for the offense overall. You know, we're not trying to get DeAndre Swift on like option routes either. It's just design plays and screens and things like that, which is good. I think credit to Shane Waldron. He's cut a lot of the fat out of this offense. But still, I mean, that target pecking order is crowded enough that I'm not sure if even DJ Moore, who probably is still the favorite to be the wide receiver 1 on this team. At least he should be. He was drafted to be. I don't even know how much higher than wide receiver 24 he can climb just because of how crowded this whole thing is. But I feel like all these guys will be very boom bust flex plays unless Williams really starts kicking ass here, which I'm not ruling out. It's totally possible. I think he's been really impressive the last few weeks. Let's talk Broncos offense in week 7, specifically Javonte Williams. Javonte Williams was awesome in week 7. I think we forget it because he was on Thursday Night Football. It was a long time ago at this point, but Williams in week 7 among running backs with 10 plus carries, according to True Media, 62.3% of the snaps, number 2 among all running backs in offensive success rate on his carries. He's tied with Aaron Jones for 4th in percentage of carries that went for 10 plus yards at 21.4%. This is a stark contrast to what he did in the first 6 weeks of the season among running backs with 40 plus carries. That's 45 running backs in weeks 1 through 6. He only played 58% of the snaps. He was 32nd in offensive success rate on his carries, 35th in percentage of carries that went for 10 plus yards, 8.5%. So, Sal, is this a fluke because the Saints defense was packing it in, or is it a sign of things to come for this run game? And I think it's important to ask this question because, number 1, the Broncos are 25th in neutral pass rate this year. They want to run the ball, and they have a great defense. That is an ideal setup for a lead back. And the games that they have before the bye, they get the Panthers this week, which is a great matchup, obviously. But then they play in Baltimore, they play in Kansas City, 2 rougher matchups before coming back to play the Falcons, the Raiders, and Browns before that late bye week. So I thought Williams looked awesome in week 7, just legitimately, like the stats, regardless of the Saints defense, the stats are backed up, I thought, by the film and his performance. But again, is this simply a one-game fluke?
No, I don't think so. Like, this was something I was trending coming into this week on Fantasy Football Live last Thursday, since they were playing on Thursday night. A lot of questions about Javonte's start sit-wise. And heading into that point, he had 3 weeks of some good usage overall. Now, if you factor in that Thursday night game in week 7, over his last month of the season, his last 4 weeks, and really since like the second half of that Jets game, it was a bad weather game. The first half was atrocious. Second half, something changed for this entire offense, the run game, and Javonte. Since then, he's averaging 16.5 opportunities a game, playing 62% of the snaps, flirting with a 15% target share during that time. So even in these tougher matchups, you have that check down ability from him with Bo Nix, feels comfortable throwing him the ball. And yeah, this week, an 8-point favorite at home against the Panthers, a smash spot of all smash spots. Every running back is getting there, it seems, against Carolina this year. So I kind of feel okay about Javonte Williams. Like, it seemed like they were trying to give Tyler Bidet, any other guy, opportunities. Then Tyler Bidet goes down. Audric Estime comes in. He fumbles a couple of times. It seems like he's now not in the conversation. And Javonte Williams is just taking these opportunities now and saying, okay, I better actually get going. And maybe that's part of it, like a motivation factor. Maybe it's the offensive line going from maybe a bottom 5 to 10 unit to now just being league average, and that's all you need at this point. Game scripts could get wonky in some of these upcoming matchups. We hope the passing game can bail him out there. But in these neutral to positive game scripts, yeah, I feel good about Javonte and this offense running the ball 15 to 20 times with him.
Yeah, I mean, he's been a check down guy each of the last 2 seasons in Sean Payton's offense. So that's a good option for him if he's going to continue to keep that floor afloat. Yeah, I mean, your notes about Audric Estime are really critical here, because I do think they've been trying to replace Javonte Williams, but Estime has quite literally not seized the opportunity. So I'm with you. I think it's going to be pitched as a fluke game because the Saints defense was so bad against the run in each of their last 2 games. You got to question some of the effort that you saw on Thursday night. A lot of people did, but the usage is trending up. I don't think the other options are about to step up. So, yeah, this should be a good ecosystem for a running back here. So I'm not completely out on Javonte Williams rest of the season. Sounds like Sal's not either. 5th and final stat for me, and got to talk about the Bucs pass catchers and Baker Mayfield in a post Chris Godwin and non Mike Evans world. Evans might miss a few weeks. Godwin is going to be out for the rest of the regular season. So, Sal, again, we have to talk about this. I did the solo recap on it on the last pod, but I kind of want to flesh out just what we're going to do with this offense going forward. Usage stats for the pass catchers in quarters 2 to 4. Evans only played 10% of the snaps in the second quarter. So I think it's good to kind of hit there. Just that's where we can kind of isolate the usage after that. Trey Palmer ran a route on 95% of the dropbacks. He was targeted on 7.5% of those routes. He was a primary outside receiver, 77.8% snaps outside. Cade Otton, 93% of the routes, targeted on 23.1% of those routes. Chris Godwin, moment of silence. Chris Godwin ran 81% of the routes, targeted on 23.5% of those routes. Of course, we know he is primarily a slot receiver for this team. So when we talk about these next 2 guys, I think that's important here to just consider that slot role. Jalen McMillan, the rookie receiver, 64.3% of the routes. He was targeted on 25.9% of them, and he was 66.7% snaps outside. Sterling Shepard, 52.4% of the routes after being the clear wide receiver 3 for a few weeks there. He was targeted on just 4.5% of those routes, and he was outside on 57.1% of those snaps that he played in quarters 2 to 4. So, Sal, the question is, 1, do we care about any of these receivers, or is this offense and Baker Mayfield, who is currently Fantasy's quarterback 2 overall, just absolutely sunk now?
Yeah, I lean towards absolutely sunk now, and we'll see what happens with Liam Cohen. But there's a couple of ways out of this, and really just one strong way. But the first way that I see is that Jalen McMillan is just a dude. Like, he can just come in and actually be somewhat of a, not 1-for-1, but enough of a replacement for Chris Godwin that you just don't feel incomplete and don't have these stalled drives, and Baker Mayfield can rely on him. And he's looked good. Like you mentioned, he earned a 25% target share, 8 targets in that game. But this season, even though he's looked good, he's been operating as the number 3 receiver, not the number 1 like he might have to for the next month, or the number 2 like most of the season is what, as of right now, it looks like. And that's a big difference when you're looking at defensive attention for a third-round pick compared to where you can just kind of be that guy the defense forgets about maybe. So that's a concern for mine. You mentioned Sterling Shepard, nearly 32, coming back from all these injuries. He's looked good. He has the connection that goes far back with Baker Mayfield. But again, is this a guy that I really want to rely on to be my 24 to 30% target share guy? How much can he actually produce on that volume is a concern for sustaining drives getting to the red zone, which is something we've seen out of this Bucs offense so far. They've been very fantasy friendly. So these are my concerns. These are why I'm like, I don't know. If Evans can come back in 2 or 3 weeks, things look a little bit better. If he hits the IR, like guys like Adam Thielen on a very similar injury in the end zone looked like for an older receiver, guys like Nico Collins hitting the IR as well with a similar re-aggravation of a hamstring. If that's the case and he's out 4+ weeks, I'm concerned for this overall offense, unless Deontay Johnson becomes a Tampa Bay Buccaneer. That's the one spot where I start to feel a little bit better in the trade market. I don't think DeAndre Hopkins, I don't think Mike Williams makes sense for this team. Deontay Johnson, somebody that I could see it a little bit more, but it's going to be tough to actually get those transactions done. If that doesn't happen and it seems like a Hail Mary, I don't really feel confident about this offense moving forward.
Yeah, I mean, I know Dave Canales just came from Tampa Bay, but do you really think the Panthers want to help out a team in their own division? I know, like, who cares? It's it's the Panthers are not winning the NFC South this year. Let's put it that way. How many more games are they going to win this year? Period. Let's get Deontay to Kansas City, Sal. For God's sakes, if we're shipping him off somewhere, let's get him to Kansas City. But no, I mean, I hear you. I think it would take a pretty big move to fix this wide receiver room. I don't know. McMillan, man, is tough because he was almost like a slot only player coming into the NFL at Washington last year, but then the Bucs have mostly used him outside, and maybe he just moves into Chris Godwin's role, but he profiles as a very different type of player than Chris Godwin. Of course, he's a different type of player than Chris Godwin. Chris Godwin is a beast, but I don't know, man. I don't want to lean this way, but I'm leaning a little bit more towards your side here of like this offense might just be sunk. They get the Falcons this week. Not a tough matchup necessarily, but Chiefs in week 9, Niners in week 10. They go on the bye and they come back and they play the Giants, which can be a little hit or miss if they can survive that pass rush. I don't know, man. Mayfield was not good in this game against the Ravens, and I think a lot of it is just because the best thing this offense does, I think Cohen has done a good job as the offensive coordinator. Mayfield has played well, but the number one thing that's great about the Bucs offense is they have 2 dudes who can dunk on you, and now they don't.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, when you lose your 2 best wide receivers who are really good, not just like, they're the guys out there we're throwing to. No, like really good. They move the needle a ton. It's going to change the entire way that you go. And we're going to see, like Liam Cohen, we've seen other offensive coordinators this year deal with some injuries. The Packers with their quarterback. Can Liam Cohen get by these next couple of weeks without Mike Evans and make this offense look decent? If so, then maybe you start to feel confident heading into the fantasy playoffs. Maybe the running backs start to get featured more in the passing game like we saw this past week. Or maybe they just lean on the run. Whichever way it is, I'm interested to see what happens the next month or so of the season.
Yeah, Cade Otton, I think, is maybe a big winner here at a tight end position that needs a lot of help all the time. All right, let's toss to our final break. We come back, we'll hit on Sal's moves to make as we head into week number 8 right after this. All right, we're back. Sal, you've got a couple moves for the people to make here. Talk to me about move number 1.
Yeah, I'm trying to buy low on Jordan Mason where I can, and I would recommend to do the same for a few reasons. The first reason, before we get to Christian McCaffrey stuff, is he hasn't had 10 fantasy points or more in 3 straight games. But all that needs a ton of context. One of those games, he had 98 total yards, fine. He didn't find the end zone or have any receptions. And then in week 6, he had over 70 yards in the second quarter, and then he gets injured, only comes back for 1 play, injures the shoulder. But heading into this week, he was off the final injury report. He got a full participation in practice, hinted that he would have his full-time role back with the 49ers, and that's what happened. He saw a season high, 86% of the snaps, handled 14 of 15 backfield carries. They just trust this dude. Like, he was even dealing with the shoulder injury, and they said, you feel good? Fine, we'll give you all the workload. That's fine. They trust this guy right now. Obviously, Ayuk's done. Jennings and Debo are very questionable for this upcoming matchup in week 8, where it's a great matchup against the Cowboys, who allow the most efficiency per rushing play this year. So you get at least one more start out of Mason. Then the bye week comes, and sure, McCaffrey, they're saying, could return in week 10. We've heard that, I think, 6 different times this year that he could return at different points. This is a very, very you can't mess with this injury. Any type of tendonitis, especially Achilles tendonitis, it probably happened before week 1 based on reports. You can just re-injure it or re-trigger it or put too much load on it too quick, and now you're out another 4 to 6 plus weeks. So this is something that I think they're going to be careful bringing back McCaffrey. If it is week 10 after the bye, sure, they ease him back in, maybe for a month or so. They continue to give him 10 touches to start, 12, 14. So you can get a legit running back who can be a flex or RB2 option for you for the next 1 to 2 months in one of the best run systems that's going to have to rely on their running game even more now due to these wide receiver injuries. So I'm buying low on Jordan Mason. I think this week it's a smash spot for him. And moving forward, he could be still this team's RB1A, 1B the rest of the year, even when McCaffrey comes back.
Yeah, it's really tough for me to imagine that McCaffrey, like, number one, you're right. Who the hell knows when he's going to come back? It's really tough for me to imagine that they just saddle him up for, 20 plus touches every single game after what we've just seen, especially because, the run game hasn't been as good, obviously, with McCaffrey, not out there and Mason in there, but Mason's been good and he's been effective. So why not try to lighten McCaffrey's load a little bit? I think he will continue to have standalone value. And like you said, maybe he gets back out there and re-aggravates this thing for a couple weeks. Mason's still a running back one in those situations if he ever has to start again. So kind of ballpark me maybe some players that you might send for a guy like Jordan Mason, especially if you do kind of accept that, maybe he has 1 to 2 to 3 more games left without McCaffrey.
Yeah, right now Jordan Mason's my 72nd overall player. It puts him behind guys like Brian Robinson, DeAndre Swift. You're probably not getting those guys in a deal, or maybe you could, but a lot of people are probably expecting McCaffrey to come back, and that's the way that they're viewing it right now. But I mean, if you could trade Tank Bigsby off his big week, 1-for-1 for Jordan Mason, that's something that I would do probably immediately right now. Chuba Hubbard, who continues to produce, even in a bad game this past week, he's out there scoring a touchdown late. That's somebody I would trade 1-for-1. Ramondre Stevenson for Jordan Mason.
I like that call. I think I would rather have Jordan Mason than almost all of those guys there. Maybe not Brian Robinson and those type of players.
Yeah, not Robinson.
But certainly anyone in the Hubbard tier. Yeah, I mean, I've enjoyed what we've gotten from Chuba Hubbard so far, but you just wonder how much longer we can continue to squeeze juice out of that particular lemon with that offense there. All right, your second and final move to make here is another running back trade target.
Yeah, it's one that's interesting to me. It's Rico Dottle coming out of his bye week for the Cowboys because I don't think people view Rico Dottle as anything super valuable for their fantasy teams. I think they'll sell him pretty low for maybe a wide receiver who just had one big pop-off week. So you're talking about him coming out of the bye week going to face the 49ers. Okay, whatever that matchup is, it is. But I'm more interested in McCarthy before the bye week. Cowboys coach Mike McCarthy was quoted to say Dottle definitely needs to touch the ball more. And now this is just coach speak. It's whatever. It's Mike McCarthy. But he said the same thing before their Week 4 Thursday night football game. He said, yeah, we got to get Rico Dottle more involved. How is he not more involved in this offense? And then Dottle went out there on Thursday night, saw his most snaps, touches, and fantasy points, and his first touchdown of the season. So there's at least a track record this season of McCarthy saying that and then it coming through, and now they're going into or coming out of their bye week. So it's interesting to me because Dottle has been trending in the right direction. 5 straight games of at least 55 total yards, 3 straight finishes as a top 25 running back. He's looked good out there as well, averaging 5 yards per touch, second in running back yards per route run this year, so an efficient receiver, and that's kind of where you can get you some of those cheap points in a matchup like he has this week against the 49ers. So I look at it and rest of season schedule heading into the fantasy postseason, matchups against the Bengals, Panthers, Bucks, Eagles. Some of those are really beneficial matchups, especially those first 3 I mentioned. I think you can get him really cheap right now. He's the top 100 player for me rest of the season, right around that mark. And I think you could be trading away guys like, Khalil Shakur off of a 7-catch game before Amari Cooper gets ramped up for Rico Dottle, who I view as the starting running back in this offense. Coming out of the bye week, we can even see a very dramatic difference in his usage in a good way. I want to buy into that.
Yeah, the 49ers are 22nd in rushing success rate allowed. They're not a formidable run defense. And, normally it's these big gashing runs that are good against the Niners. But shoot, I mean, we saw the Chiefs just steadily kind of plow away at them with Kareem Hunt, under 4 yards per carry in this one. Rico Dowdle is running back 34 in points per game, 9.6. He's not necessarily been a needle mover in fantasy for anybody. So I'm with you that it doesn't seem like he'd be a tough guy to trade for. Honestly, Sal, to me, I think about it, and maybe it's not a 1-for-1 deal of a wide receiver who just popped off. I think he could be an ideal, all right, we're trying to get a blockbuster done. Throw me Rico Dowdle, and then we finish the deal type thing.
Yeah, I agree. And I think in the point we're at in the season right now, especially waivers are going to clear by the time people hear this. It's a big waiver week for wide receiver position, of course. But if another week like that comes up, you might be able to just buy fab budget trades if you do that in your league. Rico Dottle for, $15, $20. And I think that's an absolute steal.
I'm with you. Yeah, I think if a player like that was profiling from a usage standpoint, like he was on the waiver wire, even if he didn't have a big pop week, I think $15 sounds pretty good for somebody like that. So yeah, I feel is he going to win your league? Is he that type of back? Maybe not, but I think he can be pretty solid going forward. And I feel like, coming out of the bye, I'm with you that has to be one of the things they prioritize, like more, not that Rico Dowdle's like a special player or anything, but more Rico coming out of the bye is probably a good thing for this offense overall. That's all we got for today. Sal, tell the people what you've got working on for the site this week.
Yeah, by the time you're listening or watching this, the full trade article will be out. So we'll talk about more players than just the 2 running backs right there. Thursday will be the matchups to exploit, the best matchups for the skill position players this week. And Friday will be the key findings, the things that you need to know before you set your lineups for week 8.
Love to see it. Make sure you're checking out all of Sal's content, of course, on the Yahoo universe and across everywhere else on the internet. Our guy is busy here, and we appreciate him stopping by every single week to do the data dump here on this show. We appreciate all of you for listening. That's going to do it for today. Thanks again to Sal Vetri for joining us on Thursday. The Fantasy Film Room. Oh, baby, it is back with Nate Tice. We have a ton to dive into. We're going to preview Thursday Night Football. Big game. Essentially, the Rams getting some players back against the Minnesota Vikings. We'll talk through all of that tomorrow. Until then, we are out.